Right, okay, I'm going to start the webinar. So this is the Black History Month webinar from the Clear Company. Thank you very much everyone that's joined, and I'm sure there'll be more joining. In fact, they are, as I'm looking at my dashboard. And I want to start off with a very big thank you to our speakers, our webinar panel for today. For those of you who haven't met this panel, I'm about to introduce them. We've got a group of people with immense amount of experience and expertise, and they've also got a voice that they're not afraid to use. So I'm looking forward to quite an in-depth and very transparent conversation across the four of you, which I have the pleasure to facilitate today. So just to introduce myself very briefly, because I'm a minor party on this. So my name's Kate Headley. I'm one of the directors at the Clear Company. It's my absolute pleasure to be chairing today's panel. So if we start with yourself, Tony, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Tony McCaffery. I'm founder and director at Diversity Scotland, a diversity and inclusion consultancy based in Scotland. I also work on a partnership basis with Kate and the team at the Clear Company to deliver on a number of EDI projects.
Thanks very much, Tony. Pauline? The wonderful Pauline Miller? Okay, so introducing Pauline Miller.
So I'm Pauline Miller. I'm clearly still getting used to the technology even after 8 months in lockdown. I am Head of Talent Development and Inclusion at Lloyd's of London, so I'm responsible for all of our learning and leadership development, our diversity, inclusion and wellbeing, and also our culture and engagement activities for the corporation and the Lloyd's market.
Brilliant, thanks Pauline. Mark?
Right, I'm Mark Lomas. I'm Head of Equality, Diversity, Inclusion at HS2. My role looks at diversity inclusion in the workforce, supply chain, compliance and performance around EDI, aspects of our community engagement where it touches on diversity, and overall accountability for ensuring we meet our commitments in terms of inclusive design for HS2 stations, trains and assets.
Thanks, Mark. And Amos?
Hi, everyone. I'm Amos Simbo. I'm the founder of Black Professionals in Construction, and our role essentially across the built environment is to look at how we can work effectively with communities and the industry to improve the inclusion aspects and diversity across all parts of our industry. Launched September last year. And things are going great so far, and we've been partnering up with quite a few leading construction firms.
Great, thank you. Thanks all of you and welcome. I'm going to crack straight on because I know our audience is very keen for us to start our debate. And you know, we're towards the end of Black History Month, and what a month it's been. I mean, I you know, in my experience, have never seen so much profile, so many events, so many great, meaningful discussions. So lots of debate already had. Our focus today, which I'm sure we will digress from because I know you all so well, but our pure focus originally is around education. And what we wanted to discuss was the power of education and education about Black history in mainstream education from primary and above in the UK and beyond, of course, and also touching on the education of those people in leadership roles who didn't have Black history education as part of their educational standard. How do we therefore raise awareness and encourage people to self-educate at that level? There's a number of other diversions we're going to take along the way, but to start us off with, Pauline, I know you've got some really great experience to share with us around education from your perspective.
Yeah, I guess it was only recently that I sort of thought back to my my school education and really sort of sat back and thought, how did I get to where I am today in D&I? And then remembered this deep, passionate interest in history. And my history teacher was a Black man who spent a lot of time telling us that the education curriculum wasn't broad enough, and we were a heavily populated mixed ethnic group in the class, and I took that memory on leaving school, secondary school, recognising how little I knew about my history, about Black education, about Black history in general, and what that journey looked like, you know, today. And I you know, everybody remembers, you know, King Henry, you know, Henry VIII and his 6 wives and all of that, and you miss out on so much, and you feel like you've missed a part of you. And what I did when I left school was I immediately went to college and took Caribbean history as a GCSE. Interestingly, because before coming onto this webinar, I went back and looked at my old college to see if it was still one that was available. And clearly I'm not just a couple of years out of college, a little bit older, just a little, but it's no longer available. And it does make you wonder, you know, I had the interest to go and study Black Caribbean history in, you know, however many years ago in college in the evenings as an evening adult class. And that's something that's not available even if you wanted it. And that for me says, without that knowledge and without education, how on earth can we start to make changes for the future? So I think there's a real space that says that we need to definitely move that dial of what's in our education mainstream, because it should be there all the time, but even if you have left school and wanted to go back and learn, it's still not an option. You have to go out and do that research yourself. You can't put the same level, you know, basic GCSE should be easy for everybody to be able to go out and do. Brilliant.
Thanks, Pauline. I mean, this debate between all of us started because somebody very close to me, and you all know who it is, did their first studying around race and around race equality and around Black history in second year uni. It wasn't part of their mainstream education, and that sparked a really big debate for us as a family and as a friendship group. So I'd be really interested, you know, moving on to yourself, Mark, I know your experience was very different. So, you know, what is the power of education, and what was your access to it, and how can we influence that?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that a majority of my primary school education and in the first part of my secondary school education was in Bermuda, which is a majority Black country. It's a small island, and therefore Black history was part of what we learned. It was sort of woven into the curriculum from a very early age. Not to say that it was perfect by any means. But also the exposure that you'd have to Black professionals was every day. So it wasn't something that was unusual. You know, I never experienced anyone saying how surprised they were by how bright I was until I moved to England. And I thought, well, that's an odd thing to say, but I think it's a compliment. And I think for me, there were a couple of things. When I moved from Bermuda, I went to music school here. And it wasn't the most diverse sort of cohort of people that I was in school with. There were only a few people from Black origins, and I was really surprised. I can think of about 10 or 11 of them, and maybe one person knew who Marcus Garvey was. No one had heard of Haile Selassie, etc. So all of these historical figures that I grew up with, that I knew about, that I was taught about, were absolutely alien to a lot of the people that I went to school with. And some of the rhetoric and description was different. And I think the first time I realized that was when I was visiting family in Yorkshire. I think I was very young, so I must have been sort of primary school age. And it was I think it was the first bit of British news I'd ever watched, actually. And it was Margaret Thatcher in Parliament, and she described Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. And I nearly fell off the couch, primarily because where I came from, he was seen as a freedom fighter. He was fighting against decades of oppression. And I think for me, that really solidified the impact that the way you describe and educate people has an absolutely tangible outcome on how they feel, act, and continue the discourse. And so it's something that I'm keenly aware of has an impact all across the levels of education. I think there are plenty of studies about the importance of contact theory for young children, mainly in the States, but there are some here, which indicate you know, the diversity of content, the diversity of teachers, and having close friends at a young age across racial groups is very important in people learning to understand and treat people as individuals rather than seeing other races as a kind of homogenous group for which these powerful stereotypes apply. So for me, it was culture shock is a really good word for it, actually.
Thanks, Mark. You raised some really interesting and I think for us societally challenging points there in terms of if we don't change at that base education level and start to educate and share terminology and make sure that we get that right and there's the history and bring it into mainstream education as part of our collective heritage, then the question is how far are we going to change things, I think. But really interested, Amos, to hear from you in terms of your views on your own experience through education and your view on how that could influence and impact on our ability to change going forward.
Yeah, so I'm a bit like Mark, you know, I moved to the UK when I was 15, so I had most of my education initially when I was in Zimbabwe, and it was a similar situation where, you know, everybody around me would have been black. So a lot of things, you know, we discuss these days, I never grew up actually thinking about them as a thing. I literally just saw everybody as a, you know, as a person essentially. But then when I moved across the UK, I essentially had to learn how things are, as in where do I fit, basically from the conversation you have with both black and white people. So sometimes black people say you can't say that, you know, to anybody, or sometimes you get, you know, people telling you stuff. And so, you know, I have a great example that you know, in my younger years, because my heritage is actually Zulu. So somebody called me Zulu on site, and I didn't even pay attention to it. I just thought, well, finally somebody knows where I'm from. But you know, someone actually told me that that's an insult. You know, so there's probably a lot more that happened that I never actually realized. So, you know, I think when you talk about education, it's a case of it's really important, and I think what it does is a lot of people see, you know, some people just don't get it, like in terms of why are we doing this? People just don't get it to start with, you know, because people are almost seeing the end product of it to say, oh, there's inclusion now and diversity, etc., etc. But unless, you know, you can empathize and actually see what's gone on in the past, you can never actually fully appreciate it. And the bad thing about it is it's essentially not your fault in a way, because you've never been educated on it, you know, so you actually don't know why people are doing it. You in some ways you feel offended because you're like, why are they trying to give black people an advantage over everybody else? You know, why are they doing this? It's actually because you just don't know what happened, because essentially most of the information has been deleted. So I feel like, you know, that education piece is important for a lot of people, and, you know, reaching it back into the curriculums, but even like for adults, because you can't just be saying for younger kids, you know, even on the content that people consume or see, that needs to be integrated back into, you know, you talk about when people do the remembrance for soldiers, you know, integrate into it, because there's a lot of black people that were involved in that, from Africa, from across the Caribbean, from everywhere. You know, when you see those images, you just don't see black people there, you know. So that education piece is in schools, of course, but it's our day-to-day lives. It's really important, because content that we consume is essentially education.
Yeah, absolutely. And you raised some really challenging and thought-provoking points there, Amos. I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm talking to you know, obviously this is a dialogue that's happening a lot at the moment, and I know Pauline, you and I have talked about it as well, that, you know, I'm getting lots of people saying to me, I'm really sick of having to have an intellectual debate on whether racism is a good or a bad thing, because it's actually, the debate isn't about racism. The debate is about people not understanding the Black history and how history has evolved and the circumstances that we find ourselves in as a society today. So that education that you talked about there, Amos, in terms of people realising and understanding the history, what's missing from the history, what people have experienced and those life experiences, is absolutely key to raise awareness that this debate is not about singling certain people out for privilege, but it's actually about making sure that everybody is recognised for their contribution to society, and matters hugely. So I think you know, I want your contributions. I'm going to shut up now, but I just think all three of you so far have just hopefully got the audience thinking on a different level. I know that's going to continue with you, Tony.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, absolutely. And listening to the experiences of the other panel members had me thinking there and recollecting my own experience of history at school. But actually, I think the thing that sprang to mind right now is, so I was brought up predominantly in Catholic schooling, and I'm now thinking about all of the religious imagery that was available to us at school. So we would have all of these Middle Eastern and African biblical figures who, from an imagery perspective, were white, unless they were a baddie in the story. So, you know, the Egyptians being the only ones depicted as being black. You know, and not in all cases, not even that wouldn't even be accurate, but it just makes me realise that when I look back in my own education as the only person of colour at all of the schools I went to, that there was nothing that was speaking to me, and nothing that I could, you know, there was nothing that I was seeing myself in. But particularly with that religious education piece as well that is prevalent in Scottish Catholic schools, to think back on that and actually realise that all of that iconography and all of that imagery was fueled by racism as well, and completely whitewashing, you know, all of those stories and all of those teachings from the Catholic faith.
Yeah, that's another, yet another dimension of you know, to Amos's point about, you know, imagery and symbolism just being confined to a certain demographic. So that's, you've kindly shared with us your own personal experience of education, and also how that did positively or negatively impact on your experiences through life. I'd be really interested to hear, you know, one of you wants to pick it up in terms of, so what do we feel needs to happen educatively now, so that we stop having this circular debate? Anybody want to pick that up?
I'm happy to.
Thank you, Mark.
I'm happy to pick it up briefly. I think for me, we have to have a realization that if we want an inclusive society, we've got to educate people around inclusion, because at the moment we've chosen to ignore some of those factors which influence it. So I think, you know, number one, the diversity of content which is taught in schools from a very young age needs to be improved, and throughout the levels of education as well. I love Pauline's example of a Black History GCSE. I think that's one element. I think the second element, though, is about those people that are in leadership roles, whether that be in public life or in business. And so we've not put too fine a point on it. The decision makers are for a majority white, and also white men in a number of sectors. And I think, you know, the requirement for education, or the impact of education, is very useful, because generally people see what's around them. We have the ability to reinforce our own experience. And if we don't broaden that, and deliberately, because by general osmosis isn't going to happen. You know, if we look at senior hiring, it generally tends to happen because people have a trusted pool of contacts and networks, and they hire from those networks, and that's how underrepresentation is perpetrated. So the evolution approach, the slow osmosis approach, isn't going to work. I think we have to have a period of deliberate inclusive education over a period of years if we're going to start to shift that dial. That may be an uncomfortable conversation to have with those who manage curriculums and put them together, but it's a necessary conversation. You know, quite frankly, I think, you know, my personal view is I'm quite bored of having to wait for progress. You know, I don't want to wait another 20 or 30 years. From my perspective, that's just not good enough. And I think that sentiment is being echoed in large parts of the world. And we've seen it with the Black Lives Matter movement and others. And we've got to address that. It's going to become more of an issue and not less of an issue. So a deliberate focus and a quicker pace are really important.
So, I mean, I agree with you, Martin. We've had this conversation before in terms of at leadership level. How do we stimulate that education and that self-awareness and learning from people, however well-intentioned, have not actually had the education or the exposure or the experience that they should be bringing in order to lead inclusively? Has anybody got any thoughts on how we can accelerate that positively?
Kate, the only other thing I'd probably add in, because I agree with everything Mark said, and as he was talking, it reminded me of all of the other influences that were around us in day-to-day life. I was thinking about that you would fall over to try and watch all of the Black History Month activity that is on the television over the course of the October period between all of the channels. And, if they stop come next week, that's it, your education period's done, and you start to stop thinking about what needs to change and how we need to change it. And I just think that there is an element to be said for some of those platforms, channels, media entities, some of those other parts of society that form and shape some of our opinions, because we can go in and educate leaders directly, but they need to be able to see it at other angles. They need to see those questions popping into the dialogues when they're engaging with their conversations with regulators, or when they're being held to account for ethics and values. You need it to be seeped into so many other areas that it becomes part of day-to-day life, and therefore they are required to make that change as leaders, because it is part of everything they do, because that's what you deliver what you're held accountable to, and we need to be able to have that there. But the messages and how people form their opinions is very much reliant on how well other parts of society hold these conversations as well, and that they do it throughout the year and not just as a make it brighter in October, and then the light shines, disappears.
The problem with that, Pauline, is, and I totally agree with you, the problem with that is that there's still this view, particularly from our governing leaders, that there's not that much of a problem here. And that's a difficulty. Kate and I were talking yesterday about my understanding of racism and tackling racism in Denmark, for example, which is very similar to the view in Scotland where I live, that there's no problem here, so it's not really a big priority for government to start to drive change across industry, across the curriculum, and that's just wrong. I mean, I agree with everything that Mark said earlier on, and I agree with Lavinia Stennett that we're just waiting too long now for the curriculums to change at school, and we're waiting too long now for the government to step in and to push forward some of the requirements that industry needs to be held to account, so that this does rise up their agenda and they recognise that actually there is a problem, and it's not something that can continue to be swept under the carpet, even after all of the increased noise that has happened this year. There is still an element of denial.
Anybody got a comment on Tony's point there?
Yeah, no, I've got to say I agree with what Tony's saying. Most of the things that happen to us is because it's essentially because of the drivers that's behind a lot of these things. So in the society we live, there's a lot. It's essentially capitalism, right? Which is driving profits, which is driving a lot of these things. To actually change that, looking at, because that's essentially what a lot of people will care about. From what Tony was saying, when people are saying it's not a problem, it's because it's really not a problem, because they're still delivering on their profits, they're still delivering on business, shareholders, etc. So it's actually true. It's not a problem, but you can create a problem and make it a problem. That they need to start addressing it.
That was going to be my next point, my next question actually, Amos, because you segued brilliantly into the whole consumer choice discussion, is that how do we therefore, to Tony's point, if it's not perceived as a problem or a challenge or something that needs to be addressed, then how do we, and all of us on this panel, I've worked with all of you a lot over the years, have a history of creating problems that need to be solved and getting them solved. So what are our panel members' thoughts, you know, starting with yourself maybe, Mark, in terms of, so what can we do to create the problem that needs to be solved?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. We've seen some really high-profile brand disasters around some of this stuff in the last few years, and I think that sharpens the mind somewhat, but the impact tends to be a little short-lived. And I completely agree with Amos. It takes some kind of community solidarity to be able to say, do you know what, my business is going elsewhere, and I'm not sure I see that kind of collective resolve yet. So I think it will slowly dawn on people that the route to progress is affecting the bottom line. But we don't have that kind of resolve at the moment. And I think one of the things that I'm very interested in with HS2 is how we encourage entrepreneurship and diverse-owned business. And we have requirements in our procurement about SME spending with diverse-owned business. Because frankly, waiting for direct employment to solve the issue of inclusion in employment, and it's not going to happen fast enough. Therefore, there needs to be another route, and I think that route is business ownership, entrepreneurship, organizations participating and having supplier diversity approaches. But I think there is some, you know, I'm always struck by community solidarity comes quickly and fades even faster. And when we get to that point where whole groups or whole communities, whether that be BAME, LGBTQ+, whatever, choose to take their pound elsewhere and make it known, I think at that point we'll start to see some real impact. I think my disappointment is I don't see yet the level of sort of collective community cohesion and resolve that happens on a wide scale, and maybe that will change.
There's a kind of chicken and egg as well, isn't there? That what we need is sufficient number of aware organisations doing the right thing in this space, making that consumer choice available so that the consumer has the choice to move to purchase from you know, an ethical organisation that they want to give their money to. We've had that, you know, we've worked in disability for a long time. We've had the same issue that, you know, people want to choose, but there aren't sufficient organisations out there potentially to choose from. Thanks, Pauline.
Kate, I was just going to say, I think that's what we're seeing now is that, especially in the younger generation, there are things that they're very passionate about in broadly across the community. And, you know, yes, inclusion and equality is very much one of them, and justice for individuals, and also things like climate change. You know, that is becoming a very big piece in their dialogue, that they are saying collectively, we're not going to stand for this. And that's what we've seen, and that's what we saw following the death of George Floyd. I think, you know, there is an essence that each individual person, you don't have to be a young generation that's a younger generational member of society, but everybody has the power to say, I'm not going to accept that. And, you know, it always reminds me, Mark made an excellent point there around consumers choosing where to spend their money. You know, I will happily tell anybody that I went to Aldi and I was treated like Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, and I purposely went back and told them, didn't buy your car because of exactly how you profiled me. And I will tell you that on any panel, because until they recognise that these types of behaviour, you've got to train your staff, because I don't have to spend my money with you. And that is something that we all have the power to do. In the same way we can challenge our politicians, is the same way we can say to any company, we don't want to spend our money with you. Write back to them and tell them I've chosen to go somewhere else.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. Funnily enough, I had the same experience with Land Rover. Yeah.
We're just going to out all the car companies.
Yeah. It was the point at which you ringing up saying, can you sort my air conditioning out? Have you had your husband check it? That they lost the business for quite some time. Although I understand that things have moved on significantly since then, as I haven't driven for 7 years. Tony, consumer choice, I know, is a real area for you of passion and direction. What would you add to that debate?
Absolutely, it is something that I think about a lot, and I think that it's something that we all need to think about every time we, pick up either our favourite drink. We need to question, what the business who manufactures that, what their ethics are, what the history of that product is. Whether it's popping out to the high street to pick up some throwaway fashion, what are the what's the background around how that garment was made. We really need to stop and think about ethical consumerism right across a whole host of considerations, like Pauline said, environmental through to political, human rights, and the history of these organisations, and in many cases the people who are investors in those organisations. The bee in my bonnet right now is banking, and I feel like there are not many retail banks in the UK right now that will escape my wrath when it comes to their investment choices and their history of propping up fundamentally racist approaches to business, and even the banks who claim to be ethical in their approaches. If you dig just a little bit deeper, you'll find that's not quite the case. Don't get me started, Kate.
No, well, I have. God, I've done it now. It's interesting, though, because I was listening to you talking there, both Pauline and Tony, about this, and thinking, we have a standard now, the ingredients on our packaging, and we have increasingly fair trade marks and, British tractor marks and all sorts of things that people use to inform their choices. So it's when we start to see the heritage of products as a standard part of our, public packaging, so that the public has that choice and that option, that we can, maybe those consumer choices can be more informed. Amos, I can sense you've got something that you're going to add here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, the thing about the world we live in is people don't do things to be good. They do it sometimes to be actually be bad. Like the standards are actually the opposite. Of being good. They don't do. They do to deliver, but not for not to be good to everybody else, or for profit, or to literally crush your opposition. Like words like crush, are quite common. So people are ruthless in what they're doing. That's essentially the world we live in all aspects of it. So it's not that if you were to push the agenda of diversity, we should be ruthless, but it's looking at the actual stakeholders. It's not what Mark was saying. HS2, I think so far have done a great job. There's still a long way to go from what Mark is saying, but these things are being input into the tendering processes, and all of a sudden you get somebody that would have never thought about it coming and approaching and saying, what do we do with this? It's not to essentially make everybody moral, because you can never do that. It's to make sure that as leaders we're trying to make our society fair. So even for people that don't want to be fair, make them be fair, because otherwise they wouldn't. Like the majority of business don't want to do the right thing. They actually don't want to do the right thing. They actually want to do the wrong thing, like most of the businesses. So it's championing those businesses that are doing the right thing, so we can push this across. So it's collaboratively working together. Not getting stuck on little detail, but collaboratively looking at how can we do this. Lately there's been there's been a debate about being black, all that sort of stuff. It's all right and good, but then sometimes you end up literally fighting amongst yourself for an acronym. So it's looking at ways of how can we actually make change, because the other side that doesn't want to make change is really ruthless. And if you start being petty about little things, you're already in a bad position to start with, So I think to actually change the game, it's looking at all of us, how can we work together? With putting all the small minor details aside, because we're literally up against a bigger machine that's already running.
It's interesting what you say, because with those of you that know me know that I've got immense positivity, so I believe that everybody's core intention is to do the right thing until I'm proven otherwise. That's despite many knockbacks over the nearly 60 years of having that belief. I'm still hanging on to it by a thread. So I think I'd be interested to know from the other panel members really that this position around I'm working with a lot of organisations who actually genuinely do want to and are striving to and are aware that they're not getting it right, but do want to do the right thing and do want to make progress. So I'd be interested in the view, just to balance out that discussion really, in terms of, the sort of harsh capitalism and the ruthlessness that we do see in society and in business, and what can we share with our audience about who is getting it right, what's working, and how can we make that more broadly applicable? Pauline, have you got any thoughts on that from your sector?
It's really interesting to because I at the moment, as it happens, I'm currently working through about 75 chief execs and their HR directors to talk to them about culture, gender and ethnicity. And what's really interesting is that a few of them have asked, who are the beacons in this space? And it's really tough to say this company is a beacon, because on the face of it, it looks like they're saying the right things and doing the right things. But is it actually rooted into all of the things that they do? Is it in their supply diversity policies? Is it in the way that they make their ethical decisions? How far down does it go? Of course, for Lloyd, it's been a challenge. It's been an area of focus for us, an area that we've really tried to pay some attention, really tried to listen to our colleagues and understand where we should move, how we move the dial, what they'd like to see. And of course, what some people look at and go, well, actually, Lloyds have had an involvement in the slave trade, and many organisations have, because of that was standard path and practice. And I think in some ways, to Amos's point, as long as they were making money, it was okay. You can thrive in an environment where where it doesn't impact you directly. So I think organisations now are struggling to find who's at the top of the chart, and the reality is that they're all probably languishing either at the bottom or in the middle. And that they've all got areas, not the same areas, but all got areas to focus on. And the biggest challenge we have is the lack of data to help inform that data, to inform that conversation, and the lack of a real strong structured approach to understanding the experiences of people in organisations, how their employee life cycle is experienced themselves, to then determine what we need to do about it. So that's our approach, and it's one that we're encouraging our organisations across the market to consider their data and make data an absolute priority as they consider targets for themselves, they consider how they're going to hold themselves accountable in the future.
Thanks, Pauline, and a great balanced viewpoint there as well. And you talk about data, so without the data, how do we know, how do we measure? There's also transparency and clarity around origin and decision making and investments, as Tony said. But data in its own way is complex. And again, Tony, you and I were having this debate only yesterday, because we've got organisations who want to measure, right down to by country, and what language should they use by country. To Amos's point, is we're getting in a right pickle with, what we can say where and how. I'd be really interested in the panel's views on that, we want to get the data, but how do we get that data globally and collaboratively when there are so many differences in terms of what can be shared and how it can be shared and how it's described around the world? Tony, have you got a thought on that? Putting you on the spot, I know.
No. Yes, I think, as I've said to you before, Kate, where I have observed organisations achieve this to an extent is where they've been very transparent around what they're looking to achieve, and that they've sought buy-in and people to volunteer their consent around the sharing of data. Because ultimately there's so much that culturally from country to country just wouldn't be the norm to look at from a data perspective, that you almost have to circumnavigate what are the societal and cultural norms and be very transparent about your messaging in order to get that buy-in from people, so they can see the real value of being more transparent about the data and allowing that to inform the decisions that a company makes, and then in this instance allowing consumers to have more informed buying decisions. And there's one other point just separate to that that I'd like to pick up on, which was around supplier diversity. So, of course, I've been very minimally involved in the supplier diversity activities that Mark's doing at HS2, but I think that's a really great example of and should be held up as a beacon around very good practice and being able to have that very clear focus. I mean, the scale and size of HS2 as an organisation, its remit, its project, and the work that they're doing in this, I think, is actually really positive to ensure that particularly smaller organisations in their supply chain, that there are diversity and inclusion considerations around their movement onto that supplier framework. So I think that Mark's organisation is doing some really great work in that respect, just to call out one beacon of good practice.
So I'll switch over to you then, Mark. Thanks, Tony, to respond on that. And also, I know data is really close to your heart as well, and you know, creating that environment of trust and sharing, and qualitative as well as quantitative data. That's what I'm really interested in exploring. It's not just about the numbers, is it? It's about the numbers, the experience, the progress, all of those different elements. So, Mark, you've got the floor. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's key. I mean, you know, I have a kind of favorite phrase, which is I like to treat diversity like an engineering problem. You know, you find a point of failure and you try and fix it. But numbers can hide experience, and I think a key takeaway for me is you shouldn't be afraid of your data. You know, sometimes your stats will look good, and the experience won't be so ubiquitously brilliant. That's okay. That gives you something to go after. You can't be afraid of that. You know, HS2 is not perfect. Our whole supply chain is not perfect. But what we are trying to do is encourage that open dialogue, use the data to focus our efforts, listen to the feedback, and try and do our best with it. A great example of that is after the Black Lives Matter protests with regard to George Floyd. I did an internal article in at the company, got a huge amount of response, and the CEO followed up to say, actually, the response was huge. What I'd really like to do is listen to the experiences of some of our BAME staff. You know, our data looks good. We're doing lots of work. That doesn't necessarily mean everybody's experience is great. And I think that that information for him was really powerful, and he's very personally invested in ensuring that we improve our outcomes, we improve our experience. And when we do things like employee well-being surveys and our engagement surveys, all of that has diversity data embedded into it, so we can understand how people are feeling about progression, whether they feel respected, if there are issues of bullying, harassment in certain areas of the business. Data from both a numbers and an experience perspective is hugely important, and one without the other won't get you where you need to go. And sometimes you get a bit of a disconcordance between the two. We're doing great on representation, but maybe experience isn't so brilliant. Okay, that gives you something to go. That gives you something to go after. I think I think you can't be afraid of the bad news if you want to do diversity and inclusion well. The bad news just shows you where you gotta focus, and that mixture of your sort of numbers, data, and people's experience is hugely powerful.
Thanks, Mark. I like that. Don't be afraid of the bad news. But it's also then you need to know what the bad news is. To Pauline's point, you know, we need to explore that data. We need to ask those questions. We need to collate that information and not just guess at it. Oh, we need to get this right, so let's just rip everything up and start again. When actually some of it might be right. And I'm hearing a lot is about, you know, education, interpretation, and people's, you know, attitudes and behaviours in delivering what we've got out there as well. In terms of those numbers then, Amos, I mean, obviously you've set up your organisation and working specifically in construction. Was that because that's your specific background, or do you feel that the numbers suggest that actually that is an area in the UK that we have to have a very particular look at from your perspective?
No, that's literally because that's my industry. So I've been in this industry now for probably 9-10 years. I've got consultancy, so I've been working in the fit-out market. So that's literally how we started in the industry. But then looking in the industry again, I think the construction built environment is literally one of the worst. It's a lot of things. So it's mostly culture. So it's diversity, but it's things like mental health. It's things like you know, you were saying you've got a good heart for people and you believe they do the right thing. I was actually taught, I mean, not taught, I experienced enough to actually think the opposite because, you know, not talking down on builders, but a lot of builders literally aim to do the wrong thing. I'm talking, you know, down the chains and everything. So you're literally going with the mindset of thinking, you know, someone's going to do the wrong thing. So, but then, you know, looking into construction, there's a lot of cultural issues, a lot of them, you know, gender, etc., that most of the things are cultural rather than people intentionally trying to be discriminating. You know, it's just how it is. You know, people talk down on women, people shout at you, people will walk around covered in paint. You know, it's just that sort of stuff. You know, so that's just how it is. So construction, that's how we ended up there. In terms of the data, you know, we have a network of members. So we just above 2,200 now, which is professionals, mostly within the, it's across the built environment. So I'll probably say 60% construction, the rest real estate, etc. So we try and be clever with that data, right? So we try and, you know, extract as much information as we can instead of waiting for companies or having to like ask them 10 times. It's almost like I think the best way is to simplify the issue and then at least have something on paper. You know, a lot of people say we don't know how many are there because companies are not giving us. You know, you can't keep waiting for them. You know, you find another way to do it. You know,
Yeah.
Even if it's the way, there's so many clever ways of doing estimations. You know, if we have a certain demographic of the population of the built environment, we can tell you, unless you can, it's almost putting into them to say, well, counter it then if you think that's wrong. You know, because we are so confident in this. So it's because I think, you know, what I found is that maybe sometimes with what we're trying to push, we kind of like, you know, hold ourselves back, you know, say, oh, I haven't got the data, so we're going to do nothing about it. We're just going to cry about it, you know, like instead of actually trying to find different ways of kind of doing it. So that's what we're doing. We're collecting so much information. If we present you data and say BEng, and then you say, don't call it BEng, we can call it whatever you want, you know, but at least we've got it on paper, you know. We actually have figures. So if you want to call it, I don't know, whatever name you've got it, that's like the least of the problem. You know, what you need is the numbers. So for us, that's what we're trying to do, try and get as much information as in, you know, how many people in the country, you know, like hotspots, you know, like a heat map. Where do they do, you know, sometimes we get roles or go and find a senior estimator. You know, for all you know, like a black out there. So we sort of find that information so we can be more clever about it in terms of our approach and how we collaborate with working with our partners.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Amos. So it sounds like we've got a kind of a common theme here across our panel members that, you know, the more information we've got, the better. And let's explore clever and smart ways of obtaining that. Be transparent about why and how. But equally, if we haven't got the data, don't let it stop us from starting to make progress. So not having the data, to Amos's point, isn't a reason not to act and not to do something different. I'm conscious that we've got about 10 minutes left before we need to close, and I'm really interested to hear from each of the panel members what their main point would be to our audience in terms of talking around education, talking around consumer choice. What can we do? We've all said right at the beginning, we don't want to be here in 20 years' time having the same debate with the same sort of level of awareness around us. So what can our audience and yourselves do to start to move the dial, however radical it might be, that we think we should talk about? Mark, I know you've got some radical views, so I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there are two things. A couple of things. I think for me, we should be having the discussion about whether positive action, as it's currently framed in the Equality Act, is working fast enough. And I know British society has a sort of peculiar love of the idea of meritocracy, even though it doesn't exist. And that's why quotas really do provoke such a visceral reaction, and people still confuse positive action with positive discrimination. But it's an interesting, yet I think difficult conversation to have, to say, actually, does the UK need a 25-year period of affirmative action, which is more closely aligned to the US model in terms of moving the dial a little bit. A concept that I think culturally would be deeply, deeply unpopular, actually, but nevertheless worth a good old debate, argument, reasoning over, I think, because otherwise I don't see any indication that we're not going to be here in 20, 30 years time and having a similar conversation. I think the second for me is that that idea of being deliberate, and to play into Amos's point about you follow the money, absolutely follow the cow. Why is it in 2020 that so few organizations and their senior leaders have any kind of link to their remuneration around diversity and inclusion outcomes? And for those that do, it seems, ooh, this is quite radical. I think we have to be quite deliberate about that. If you're a leader, you lead an organization which has an impact on people, you should be measured around diversity and inclusion. That should be part of your pay package. And then I think the third thing for me, I know I said a couple, I always do that. I'd say two things and then I've got three, or three things and I've got two. To build on the concept of ruthlessness, I'm in favor of that, actually. You know, I'm in favor of organizations being really explicit with leadership. Your role is to lead people effectively. People are diverse. We want to be an inclusive organization. If that's not what you want, work somewhere else. Plenty of places will have you, but work somewhere else. Yeah, I just think, you know, the reliance on evolution is just, it's failed. Let's be blunt, it's failed. I think we need a little more disruption and a revolutionary type approach if we're going to move the dial in the next 20 years. None of which I think necessarily would be concepts you could arrive at in a sort of broad public domain without quite a considerable period of culture change behind it. Nevertheless, it's always worth starting a good old argument about it.
If we don't have the discussion, you know, and if we don't have the dream, we can't realise it, basically. But if we don't start the debate, we're never going to get to the end of it, I suppose. Pauline, another one of our radical thinkers. What are your thoughts in terms of blue sky thinking? What could make a difference here?
So I think it's really interesting. I'm probably less I'm probably not as radical as Mark, but I think it's the same guys. I think it's very similar views. So I think, you know, we've already talked about holding the data, etc., and all of those pieces. But my view is you've got to hold people to account. So it's really that element of holding people, and I don't just mean the leaders, it's managers as well, it's individual people as well. The reality is that the more you encourage, the more you hold people to account, and the more you publicly, internally in your organisations, externally on your websites, say that you are committed to this agenda, committed to moving the dial, the more your people should be speaking up. And unless you have been absolutely brilliant at this and you have no issues in your organisation, which your data probably doesn't support that, you will start to see more comments coming from staff. They will become more aware of what experiences they are, what's happening to them, what they're experiencing. And my suggestion would be is that most organisations will see an increase in complaints, grievances, and challenges, and that is a good thing. It's a bit like don't be scared of the data, don't be scared of unearthing something. So you've got to do that, but once you do unearth it, you then have to hold people to account, and you have to fire some people. You have to hold them to disciplinary hearings or whatever that looks like. In, you know, as a in the outputs, is you have to stand by what you've said you will do. So it is really important that culturally you stand by what you've said. And for individuals, we all have a voice. You know, I always say to my children, you know, my grandmother did not come to this country for you to not use your voice. So use your voice when you vote. Yeah, we have the voice. We have money, we have resources. Even if we have little money, it is still a choice where we choose to shop. It is still a choice what product we choose to buy. So use your voice, use your resources. It's a powerful message that you are able to send. And you can do that in your organisations, you can do that in the external world, in retail as well, and consumer base.
Brilliant, thanks Pauline. And I agree entirely with all that you said, obviously. I'm feeling all excited and empowered now. I want another two hours on the webinar. Tony, radical thinking, what comes from your corner?
Well, I agree with everything that Mark and Pauline said there. Some really great tips and things to consider. If I focus perhaps on going back to the school curriculum, I would suggest that the first thing is about really understanding actually what needs to be reformed. So, you know, being aware of the outputs of things like the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and Windrush lessons learned and all of that stuff that really provides us with more detail, including information from the Runnymede Trust as well, that provides us with more detail about what's lacking in our education curriculum and the things that we need to focus on. And once you understand that, I think it's then about writing to your local MP, your local councillor. It's also about writing to Kirsty Williams if you're in Wales, to John Swinney if you're in Scotland, to Nick Gibb if you're in England, and saying, you know, you need to be investing in better teacher development around Black history and history for people of colour, and you need to be moving this forward. You know, Wales are saying it will be 2022 before they even start to get this into their school curriculum. That's not good enough. I'm still waiting to hear back from John Swinney about when it's going to happen in Scotland. Not good enough. And Nick Gibb is giving no timescale and no commitment whatsoever for England. So again, not good enough. We need to start to put pressure on our elected representatives to make these changes to drive that education for the future generation.
Okay, can I just add,
yeah, of course.
To that point, to Tony's specific point, you can also drive it with your schools. Talk to the head teacher. You have a parent voice. If you're a parent, a community person, you can ask the head teacher and you can push for the optional curriculum to, content to be added into the curriculum, because it's there and it's optional when they choose not to add it. Ask your head teachers. I was a governor for 10 years. You will have a say at that governing table if you put your voice in.
And that's a really good point, actually. You know, by all means, become a school governor as well. Get more involved. Speak to your school governors. I mean, look at our colleague Jenny Hines, who's very involved in her children's school, and, you know, makes a massive impact to push forward, you know, things that are important to her and the children in that school. So absolutely, that's another great point, Pauline.
Yeah, absolutely, Pauline. Thank you. Amos, anything to add from a, you know, what should we be doing? So as individuals or as organisations, what can we do?
I think, yeah, on the radical thinking, I think everybody said really good points. But to add to that is, you know, I'm talking, you know, for Black people, Asian, etc., etc. You know, it's almost like sometimes people are waiting for somebody to give them their rights. You know, to say, oh, I don't have them because you didn't give them to me. Like, you already have them. You know, like already. You know, find other ways to do it. Like, you know, as a network, the reason why, you know, everybody's, we literally just started so that we could network amongst ourselves and try and help each other circumvent. If at all companies, you know, don't, you know, a lot of them, there is quite a few of it that are receptive, and we're looking at, okay, how can we work with those ones only? Like, if anything, what can we do ourselves? How can we help ourselves individually? There's so many educated, you know, Black, Asian people. There's so many people that can assist each other. You know, just find a way, like a bit like water, you know, just find a way to do it. So if it's radical thinking, don't just, like, you know, like just making a bit of noise about it or writing a caption about it. It's not good enough. You know, get up. What can you do? If there's somebody that you can help with their CV or whatever, you can help them get opportunities. Actually take it seriously. You know, go to Mark and say, Mark, can you help somebody else? You know, go to Tony, go to Pauline, and say, you know, you can actually do it yourself, essentially. You know, it's if it's radical thinking, don't just wait. You know, like, do something afterwards, you know, because you got so much more power than you think, you know, like essentially, like, I'm not just saying this, but last year I knew nothing about diversity, and now I'm seeing people say, what do we do about this? And I'm like, I don't know, like, but it's because literally I just put myself in that position, you know, and then people assume you're not, so you can actually do a lot more than you think, you know, you can actually do a lot more than you think. So if it's radical thinking, just get out there and just try and be that change that you want to see.
Thank you. I think what a great note to end on. You can do much more than you think. We've had some common themes which are, it's just not good enough, has come up very regularly throughout this last hour, that we've got the power for ourselves. And I think the important point there, Amos, that I'd like to pick up on as well, we've got the power as a collective. So if we can collectively work together, support each other to keep these debates going, have these discussions, table them as individuals, as parents, as business people, as colleagues, as friends, as family, then we've got more power than we think we might have, and let's start to use it positively to create that change. I just want to say a massive thank you. You've shared individually, you've shared personally, and you've shared from your immense professional experience, and I'm so grateful for that, and I'm sure the audience are as well. So thanks to Tony, Pauline, Mark and Amos. Really enjoyed having your company this morning. This webinar will be available as a captioned webinar from the Clear Company website, and will be put out on social media as well. So if anybody wants access to it, please do let us know. And please do follow these great people. They're active on LinkedIn and social media. They're doing great things. So there's more to come from them. Thanks very much indeed. Time to close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.